I was born in the bustling port of Boston, the son of a shipwright from Spain and a mother whose roots ran deep among the native peoples of this land. Our small home always smelled of fresh timber, ink, and the earthy aroma of her herbs. My father's hands were calloused strong from years of shaping wood and repairing vessels that braved the Atlantic, while my mother's hands were delicate yet purposeful, tending the garden, sewing, and teaching me the quiet rhythms of life. I grew up among 5 siblings, our days filled with laughter, arguments, and the steady hum of city life. Yet beneath the ordinary routines, the currents of discontent flowed through our streets. My father often spoke in low, weary tones about the ever-increasing taxes and restrictions imposed by the crown, his eyes dark with worry. My mother, though gentle, would press a hand to my shoulder and whisper caution, urging me to observe before acting. Even my brothers argued heatedly, some drawn to the promises of independence, others fearing the wrath of the British. As for me, I felt a restless, stirring a mixture of admiration for their courage and fear for what lay ahead. I knew that the choices we would make were not just ours, but would ripple across our family, our community, and perhaps even history itself. And so, even in those quiet evenings by the fire, a seed of determination took root within me, unknowingly preparing me for the storm to come. Boston was a city alive with tension and unrest, its cobblestone streets crowded with merchants, sailors, and townsfolk who carried whispers of rebellion like sparks in dry tinder. The harbor, usually a place of commerce and chatter, now seemed shadowed by British patrols, their red coats a constant reminder of authority pressing down on every corner of our daily lives. Posters and pamphlets littered the streets, proclaiming the injustices of taxation without representation, and I often found myself lingering to read the words, feeling both anger and fascination at the fervor that gripped our people. The air was thick with debate. In the taverns, men argued passionately over the merits of resistance versus submission, voices rising and falling like the tide. Friends and neighbors split along these invisible lines. Loyalty to the crown clashed with the desire for freedom, and families like mine felt the strain. Even a casual stroll through the market could reveal the simmering tension. A merchant refusing to pay the tea tax, a soldier's glare cutting through the crowd, a child clutching a pamphlet repeating phrases they barely understood. I saw more clearly with each passing day that this was no longer a matter of distant politics. The struggle had seeped into every home, every workshop, and every hearth. It shaped the way we spoke, moved, and even thought. For me, the pull of the revolution was growing irresistible. The ideals of liberty, justice, and self-determination seemed within reach, yet perilously close to danger. It was a city on the edge, and like everyone else, I would soon be caught in the tide that threatened to sweep us all into a war that would change our lives forever. I had grown accustomed to the daily grind of our neighborhood, yet each day brought new reminders of the crown's grip. I watched men and women harassed for speaking out, merchants fined for defying regulations, and children forced to salute soldiers in red coats as if obedience were a requirement of survival. Once I saw a young boy nearly dragged from the street for trying to distribute leaflets, urging resistance, his cries echoing in the alleyways. The scene left a knot of helpless anger in my chest. I could not turn away yet. I feared stepping forward would bring ruin upon myself and my family. At night, I would sit by the fire listening to my father's cautious laments and my mother's gentle warnings. Their words spoke of caution and pragmatism, but my mind roamed further. I imagined a life where we were free to govern ourselves, where a man's worth was measured by his deeds and not his loyalty to a distant king. I felt a stirring I could not ignore, a mixture of fear and longing that whispered of something greater than the narrow streets of Boston. Each act of oppression, each injustice witnessed, strengthened a quiet resolve within me. I knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, that friends might fall, and family could be torn apart, but the idea of freedom called to me with a force I could not resist. It was then that I understood I could no longer remain a bystander. I would have to choose a side, and I would have to act. I often found myself wandering the streets alone, pondering the choice that loomed over me. Could I really take up arms against the very power that governed our city, risking my life and the safety of those I loved? I replayed my father's grave warnings in my mind and my mother's gentle pleas for prudence. But the more I thought, more I realized that caution alone could not change the tide of history. In the quiet of the night, I spoke to myself as though seeking counsel from an invisible mentor. "What will you do, Samuel?" I would whisper. "Stand idle or stand with those who dream of liberty?" The question gnawed at me. My heart told me that inaction was complicity, that choosing safety over justice would leave me hollow in the years to come. Yet fear still lingered a shadow on every decision. It was in these moments of solitude that I began to understand the weight of my choice. The road ahead would be perilous, strewn with loss and uncertainty, but it was a path I could no longer deny. I felt the first spark of resolve ignite within me, a resolve that would carry me into the storm, shaping who I was to become in the days of fire and struggle that awaited. The dawn of a new day brought with it the certainty that nothing would remain the same. I could feel it in the tension that hung over the streets, in the hurried whispers of neighbors, and in the wary glances of soldiers patrolling every corner. I knew that soon I would have to step beyond the familiar alleys and markets of Boston and into a world of uncertainty, danger, and bloodshed. My decision did not come suddenly, but rather as a slow, relentless awakening. I remembered the faces of those I had seen oppressed. The boy dragged from the street, the merchants forced to bend under unjust laws, and the fire within me blazed brighter. Freedom was not a gift that would arrive on its own. It demanded action, courage, and sacrifice. That evening, I took pen in hand and wrote to my family. My words trembled at first, reflecting both fear and determination. I promised them I would do my best to survive, to honor our home, and to fight for a future where our people could breathe freely. As I sealed the letter, I understood that once I crossed this threshold, there would be no turning back. The path of rebellion awaited me, lined with trials that would test every ounce of my resolve, and I was ready, or at least I hoped I was, to face whatever the coming storm would bring. The morning I arrived at the training camp, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that clung to me like the morning fog. The air was thick with smoke from countless fires where recruits cooked their meager breakfast, and the clatter of muskets being cleaned echoed across the wooden barracks. I had never imagined that leaving my family would place me in a world so raw and unyielding. My heart pounded as I stepped forward, the eyes of seasoned officers scanning us like hawks. Every gesture, every posture, every twitch of muscle seemed to be judged, and I realized quickly that the war would demand not just courage but discipline. Our days began before sunrise with long marches that left blisters on my feet and exhaustion in my bones. The instructors drilled us endlessly how to load a musket swiftly, how to march in formation, how to respond to commands without hesitation. I struggled at first, fumbling the sequence of loading and firing, my hands trembling under the weight of the weapon. Yet each time I faltered, a comrade would clap my shoulder, muttering words of encouragement. Slowly, my fear transformed into focus, and the rhythm of the drills became almost meditative, a dance between life and survival. Beyond the physical strain, the mental lessons were relentless. We learned to anticipate the enemy, to read the terrain, to act as one unit. Even the smallest error could cost lives, a fact that weighed heavily on me during every exercise. Nights were spent in the chill of the tent muscles, aching ears alert to every creak, and whisper wondering if the distant drums of war would reach us sooner than expected. Amidst the exhaustion and discipline bonds formed between us, we shared stories of home laughter fleetingly breaking through the tension in silent moments when words felt insufficient. I began to understand that camaraderie would be as vital as skill. A soldier alone was a vulnerable soul in the storm of battle. Each day at the camp was a test not only of body and mind, but of resolve. I could feel the man I had been back in Boston, fading, replaced by someone shaped by hardship, duty, and the first true taste of what it meant to fight for something greater than oneself. By the time the sun sank behind the distant hills, painting the camp in amber light, I knew the lessons were far from over. The war outside the fence waited for no one, and every drill, every march, every whispered warning was a preparation for the storm that lay ahead. I was learning inch by inch that courage was forged not in moments of glory, but in the quiet, grueling labor of becoming ready to face the unimaginable. The day I left Boston for the front, the city seemed both familiar and strangely distant. The streets I had known since childhood were alive with the usual bustle: merchants hawking goods, children darting between the legs of adults, sailors hauling cargo from the harbor, but beneath it all, a tension hummed, reminding me of the choice I had made. My pack was light, containing little more than essentials, but my heart carried the weight of farewell. I lingered at our small home drawing in the scent of my mother's herbs, the smell of my father's sawdust-stained hands, and the warmth of my siblings' hugs. My mother pressed a hand to my cheek, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Be careful, Samuel," she whispered. "Remember who you are and come back to us safe." My father's voice was quieter but no less heavy with emotion. "Stay sharp. Trust your instincts." And remember that freedom often demands more than courage, it demands sacrifice. Walking through the streets, I encountered neighbors and friends whose faces were etched with worry or guarded hope. Some offered words of encouragement, others only nods, their eyes betraying fear for what might come. Even the boys I had played with in the alleys looked at me differently, as if I had already stepped across an invisible line into a world they could not yet comprehend. As I approached the edge of the city, I felt a lump form in my throat. Each step was a reminder that the familiar comforts of home were behind me, replaced by the uncertainty of the open road and the unknown dangers ahead. I kept my pack close, but I felt the invisible burden of responsibility pressing down, responsibility to my family, to my friends, and to the cause that had called me from my quiet life. I took a final breath of the crisp morning air, letting the scents and sounds of Boston imprint on my memory. The letters I had written to my family, folded and tucked safely in my coat, felt like a fragile bridge between my past and the future. I did not know what awaited me beyond the horizon, only that the path I had chosen could not be undone. With every beat of my heart, I stepped forward, carrying hope, fear, and the determination to face the storm that would shape the rest of my life. My first assignment was simple in description, but daunting in reality. I was to carry a message from our commander to a nearby outpost, passing through roads watched by British patrols. The moment the orders were given, a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. I had trained for drills, for marches, for the handling of a musket, but nothing could fully prepare me for the uncertainty of moving through enemy-controlled territory. The path led me through winding lanes and dense woods, shadows stretching long under the early morning sunday. Every rustle of leaves, every distant footfall made my heart race. I gripped the folded parchment in my pocket as if it were a talisman, a tangible connection to the cause and a reminder that even small acts could shape the course of the war. I moved cautiously, keeping to the edges of the road, eyes scanning for movement, ears attuned to every unusual sound. Along the way, I encountered other young men from the militia, faces pale with tension, hands shaking slightly as they checked their weapons. We exchanged nods and brief words of encouragement, our camaraderie, a fragile shield against the fear gnawing at us. One fellow whispered about an encounter with a patrol the night before, his voice trembling as he described how close he had come to capture. I felt my own fear spike, but I knew that hesitation could be fatal. Forward was the only direction. The landscape itself seemed complicit, and the challenge, muddy fields, fallen branches, and the distant smoke of settlements gave the impression that danger could emerge from anywhere. I pressed on every step, a test of endurance and nerve, feeling the weight of responsibility to deliver the message intact. I imagined my commander waiting, counting on me, trusting that I would not falter. By the time I reached the outpost, muscles aching and breath ragged, I realized something profound. The war was no longer a distant idea or abstract ideal. It was a living, breathing force full of peril and consequence. My first mission, though minor in the grand scheme of the revolution, had demanded more than training. It had demanded focus, courage, and resolve. In that moment, I understood that each task, each choice, each step forward was part of a larger storm that I had willingly stepped into, and there would be no turning back. The first time I stood on an actual battlefield, the world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The clash came suddenly, gunfire echoed through the trees, and the sharp crack of muskets was accompanied by the low rumble of cannon. Smoke curled in thick choking plumes, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder that stung my eyes and burned my lungs. The ground trembled beneath the weight of marching feet, and the cries of men both shouting orders and calling for comrades created a cacophony that I could neither escape nor comprehend fully. I pressed myself low behind a fallen log, my hands trembling as I reloaded my musket for what felt like the 100th time in seconds. Each shot fired brought a mixture of adrenaline and terror, fear for my own life and sorrow for those around me. I saw friends I had trained with falter, stumble, and fall. The chaos of battle stripped away any notion I had held of war being a distant noble cause. It was brutal, immediate, and merciless. Despite the fear my senses sharpened, I noticed the patterns in the enemy's movements, the signals of our officers, and the faint calls of my comrades urging me forward. Every decision, no matter how small, mattered. I found myself moving instinctively, reacting to sounds and gestures I had never imagined I would understand. Amid the smoke and blood moments of clarity emerged a fellow soldier stumbling, a comrade shouting, a cannonball whistling past each instant, demanding attention and courage. By the end of the skirmish, I was covered in mud and grime, my uniform torn, and my hands blistered from the musket's recoil. Yet even as I caught my breath and counted the losses around me, a strange clarity settled in my mind. I understood that this chaos, this terror was the reality of fighting for freedom. No training, no speeches, no ideals could fully prepare a man for what he would see, feel, and endure. I had survived, but I had also been irrevocably changed. The war was no longer a story I had heard in whispers. It was the life I now lived, and the storm had only just begun. After the smoke cleared and the sounds of battle faded into distant echoes, I found a quiet moment to reflect on what I had endured. My hands still shook from the musket's recoil, and my lungs burned from the acrid smoke, but more than the physical strain, it was the weight of experience pressing down on me. I realized that training had taught me the mechanics of war, but nothing could have prepared me for the chaos, the fear, and the sudden loss of life I had witnessed firsthand. I thought about the friends I had marched with, some lying wounded, others gone entirely, and I felt a bitter pang of sorrow and responsibility. Each mistake, each hesitation could have meant death, not just for myself, but for those around me. The battlefield had become a harsh teacher demanding lessons I could not ignore. And yet, in the midst of fear and exhaustion, I began to understand the rhythm of survival. I learned to anticipate, to observe, to act decisively, and to trust not only my own instincts, but also the bonds formed with comrades in the storm. In the following days, as I moved with the militia and took on new tasks, I found that my confidence grew tempered by humility. I could read the terrain more keenly, follow commands with precision, and sense the subtle cues that signaled danger. The lessons of experience were relentless and unforgiving, but they also instilled in me a sense of purpose. Each challenge became a measure of my growth, each small victory a reminder that courage and preparation were inseparable. By the time I returned to camp, I carried not only the fatigue of physical exertion, but also a deeper awareness of what it meant to be a soldier in this revolution. I had glimpsed the reality behind the ideals, seen the cost of freedom, and begun to shape myself into someone capable of facing the trials ahead. In that quiet reflection, I understood that the war would continue to teach, to challenge, and to transform me, and that every step forward was both a test and a chance to prove myself worthy of the cause. The morning we reached the slopes of Bunker Hill, a thick fog hung low over the battlefield, blurring the edges of reality and heightening the tension in my chest. Our unit, ragged and anxious, huddled behind hastily constructed earthworks, the scent of damp soil mingling with the acrid stench of gunpowder. I could see the red coats of the approaching British soldiers through the mist, their disciplined formations, a stark contrast to our uneven ranks of farmers, laborers, and tradesmen. Fear gripped me, but beneath it stirred a fragile flame of resolve. This was the moment we had been preparing for, the first true test of our courage and of our fledgling cause. The first volley shattered the quiet musket fire ripping through the fog, followed by the thundering roar of cannonballs striking our barricades. Screams and shouted orders pierced the chaos, mingling with the groans of men struck down by the hail of bullets. I pressed myself to the earth, fumbling with my musket as the smoke choked my lungs and fired when I could each shot a desperate assertion of life and defiance. Beside me, comrades fell or faltered, their faces pale with terror, yet they pressed on, driven by a shared commitment that I struggled to fully comprehend. Time lost meaning in that haze of smoke and mud. Moments stretched, then collapsed each second, demanding a decision: shoot, move, duck, survive. I felt the sting of a bullet grazing my shoulder, pain flashing sharp and sudden, but the fear of inaction drove me to keep fighting. Around me, men called for reinforcements, for aid, for one more volley to hold the line. I realized that courage was not a grandiose feeling, but a series of small, deliberate choices made in the teeth of danger. By the time the battle subsided, the hill was littered with fallen comrades and the wounded groaning in the aftermath. I sank to the ground, mud-slick and exhausted, staring at the smoke curling into the gray sky. The victory, though ours in spirit, was costly, too costly to be ignored. I had survived, but survival came with the bitter understanding that freedom demanded more than idealism. It demanded sacrifice, endurance, and an unflinching face-to-face with mortality. In that crucible of fire and blood, I took my first true step into the reality of war, and I knew that nothing in Boston, nothing in my past life had prepared me for what lay ahead. After the smoke cleared and the echo of musket fire faded, the battlefield revealed its grim truth. The ground was littered with the fallen, some still trembling in the final throes of life, others lying silent beneath a blanket of mud and blood. My heart ached as I moved among the survivors, searching for familiar faces. Friends I had trained with, men whose laughter had eased long marches and harsh drills, now lay injured or gone entirely. The weight of the loss pressed down on me heavier than any musket I had carried. A sharp pain flared in my leg where a stray bullet had grazed me, and I stumbled to a nearby trench, pressing a hand to the wound. It was nothing life-threatening, but the sting of it, combined with the exhaustion and the horror around me, made each breath a labor. I could hear the groans of the wounded, their pleading and murmurs blending with the distant cries of officers rallying the remaining troops. I wanted to turn away to escape the scene, but I knew that looking, acknowledging, and learning from what had occurred was a part of survival. In that moment, I confronted the reality that war was neither abstract nor noble in the way I had imagined. It was visceral, immediate, and indiscriminate. A man could train for months, understand every command, yet still fall victim to chance or circumstance. I realized that fear would never leave me completely, and that courage was not the absence of terror, but the mastery of it. As I tended to my wound and helped carry the injured to makeshift triage areas, I began to understand the unspoken bonds that held us together. The men around me, despite exhaustion and grief, pressed on with remarkable determination. I learned that survival depended as much on trust, mutual support, and quick thinking as it did on skill with a musket. Each act of bravery, however small, made the difference between life and death. By the end of the day, my body ached, my clothes were soaked with sweat and blood, and my mind struggled to reconcile the ideals that had drawn me to fight with the harsh reality I now faced. The taste of victory was bitter, tinged with sorrow and shock. But even amid the pain, I felt a flicker of resolve. I had survived this trial, and I knew that what I had learned about fear, loyalty, and the fragile line between life and death would shape every decision I would make in the battles yet to come. In that crucible of fire, I had glimpsed both the cost and the necessity of the struggle for freedom. As the battle waned and we began to regroup, a sudden flanking maneuver by the British caught a small detachment of our men, including myself, in a narrow stretch of woods. The trees, once a shield, became a trap as red-coated soldiers closed in from both sides. The moment we realized the danger, my heart pounded violently. Fear gripped every nerve and instinct overtook reason. We attempted to scatter, but the terrain was unforgiving. Fallen logs, tangled underbrush, and slick mud hindered our movement. I could hear the shouts of the enemy, the crack of rifles, and the rapid footfalls closing in. A comrade fell beside me, groaning in pain, and I barely had time to pull him to cover before another volley forced me deeper into the woods. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. Surrounded by the enemy, the world contracted to the pounding of my own heart and the desperate need to survive. When capture became inevitable, a strange calm washed over me. My hands, once trembling, steadied as I raised them in surrender, understanding that defiance could be fatal. The British soldiers bound us and began marching us toward their encampment. Each step was heavy, not only with the weight of our meager possessions, but with the knowledge of the uncertainty that awaited. Would we be treated as prisoners, or would the chaos of war decide our fate before reason intervened? In that forced captivity, I had time to reflect on the choices that had led me here. The ideals I had cherished, the dreams of liberty, the hope for a free community, felt both more precious and more fragile than ever. I watched the disciplined efficiency of the enemy and noted their humanity amidst the cruelty. Even as captives, small gestures of fairness or restraint reminded me that war was complex, a tangle of morality and necessity of courage and fear. By the time we were released in a prisoner exchange, my body ached, my spirit was weary, and my mind had been irrevocably altered. I had glimpsed the edge of mortality and understood the precariousness of each decision on the battlefield. The experience left me humbled and sharper aware that survival required not only strength and skill, but patience, observation, and an unflinching acceptance of the unpredictable nature of war. I stepped back into our lines, carrying the lessons of captivity, ready to face whatever storm lay ahead with a new, hard-earned perspective. The days following the skirmishes were filled not only with preparation and marching, but with a gnawing unease that settled deep in my chest. I had witnessed death, injury, and destruction on a scale I could hardly reconcile with the ideals that had drawn me into this fight. Liberty and freedom, once clear and shining in my mind, now seemed entwined with pain, loss, and the messy, unforgiving reality of war. Each time I saw a fallen comrade or a civilian caught in the crossfire, a sharp pang of guilt struck me, leaving me questioning the righteousness of our cause. I would lie awake at night staring into the darkness of my tent, the sounds of distant artillery and murmurs of the camp around me, and replay the day's horrors over and over. Could freedom justify this suffering? Was our struggle truly noble if it demanded so much blood and sacrifice? I recalled my family's faces, the worry etched on my mother's brow, my father's stern caution, my siblings' innocent laughter, and I wondered whether my pursuit of ideals would cost more than I was willing to bear. Yet, alongside these doubts, a stubborn ember of conviction burned within me. I reminded myself that the men beside me had chosen this path willingly, that their courage and sacrifice were not in vain. Each act of heroism, each small decision to protect a comrade or push forward in the chaos, was a testament to the strength of human resolve. I began to understand that moral clarity in war was often a luxury. Choices were rarely black and white, and the line between right and wrong blurred amid smoke, mud, and fear. The more I wrestled with these internal conflicts, the more I realized that my understanding of courage, loyalty, and justice had to evolve. It was no longer sufficient to cling to youthful notions of honor or romanticized visions of battle. Survival demanded pragmatism, empathy, and the willingness to make agonizing decisions in split seconds. At the same time, the spark of idealism, the hope for a better world refused to die, guiding me through despair and reminding me why I had taken up arms in the first place. By the time we moved to our next position, I had gained a new clarity. The war would continue to test me not only physically, but morally and emotionally. I had glimpsed the profound cost of freedom and the delicate balance between principle and necessity. Though my mind was burdened with the weight of what I had seen, I felt a strengthened resolve. I would fight, yes, but with awareness, with conscience, and with the recognition that the journey toward liberty was as much an inner battle as it was a confrontation with the enemy on the field. After weeks of relentless engagement, I found myself increasingly isolated on the front lines. Our unit had been split during a skirmish near a dense forest, and I moved cautiously through the trees, relying on instincts honed through previous encounters with danger. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind set my nerves on edge. I was acutely aware that a single misstep could mean death, and yet despite the fear, there was a strange clarity that came from being entirely focused on survival. The environment itself was a challenge. Mud clung to my boots, rain soaked through my uniform, and the uneven ground threatened to betray every step. I crept along the perimeter of a field, musket-ready eyes, scanning for movement, listening for the slightest hint of enemy patrols. Shadows of the trees played tricks on my mind, and I found myself holding my breath at each distant sound, each rustle, each echo. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, exhaustion threatened to drag me down, but retreat was not an option. Occasionally, I encountered scattered comrades equally weary and wary. We exchanged quick nods, whispered reassurances, and shared scant provisions before moving on. These fleeting connections, though brief, reinforced the sense that survival was not only a personal effort, but a collective one. Trust became a lifeline as essential as the weapon I carried, and I realized that even in isolation, the bonds forged in battle were crucial to keeping hope alive. Nightfall brought new perils. Shadows deepened, sounds amplified, and the uncertainty of what lay beyond each tree or mound pressed heavily on my mind. I dug temporary cover where I could, huddling close to the earth, muscles tense, senses alert. In those moments, time seemed suspended, and every decision, whether to move, to wait, or to take a risk, carried weight. I learned that instinct, observation, and patience could save a life, and that fear, when acknowledged and controlled, could sharpen rather than paralyze. By the dawn of the following day, I had survived yet another night in hostile territory, battered but resolute. The isolation, the struggle to endure, and the necessity of vigilance had transformed me. I understood with a deep certainty that to continue fighting for freedom, I would need not only courage and skill, but also patience, awareness, and the ability to adapt to circumstances that could shift in an instant. The war had become not just a test of arms, but a trial of mind and spirit, and I was beginning to learn its harsh lessons. As I regrouped with the remaining members of our unit, the lessons of the battlefield settled into my mind like sediment in water. The chaos, the fear, the loss, all of it carried meaning beyond mere survival. I realized that skill with the musket speed and loading and agility in the mud were only parts of what it took to endure. Equally crucial were observation, understanding the enemy's tactics, and above all, relying on the men beside me. Survival was rarely solitary. The bonds forged in the heat of combat were as vital as any weapon. I observed how seasoned soldiers moved, anticipating threats and watching one another's backs, and I took careful note. Trust was not given lightly, yet it was indispensable. A shared glance could communicate a warning, a hand on a shoulder could offer reassurance, and a simple nod could coordinate a maneuver without a single word. In those moments, I understood that our strength was collective, that each man's courage reinforced the others, and that the line between life and death often depended on the cohesion of a group rather than the heroism of an individual. At the same time, I reflected on the human cost of war. The friends I had lost, the injuries suffered, and the civilians caught in crossfire weighed heavily on my conscience. I realized that leadership and courage were inseparable from responsibility and compassion. Every decision, no matter how small, could have far-reaching consequences. I began to internalize the discipline my officers had drilled into us, not just the physical movements, but the mental preparation, the vigilance, and the adaptability that could mean the difference between life and death. By observing, learning, and reflecting, I grew more than just a soldier. I began to understand the rhythm of war itself. I learned to balance fear with calculation, impulse with strategy, and instinct with observation. Each skirmish, each night spent in hiding, and each exhausted step across unfamiliar terrain taught me resilience and focus. I understood that while ideals such as freedom and justice had brought me to this fight, it was the practical lessons, trust, coordination, vigilance, and adaptability that would carry me through the trials ahead. As the sun rose over another battered battlefield, I felt a sense of grim clarity. The war was no longer an abstract concept or a distant cause. It was a living, relentless force shaping men, testing bonds, and demanding that we evolve or perish. I had begun to grasp the true meaning of camaraderie and the harsh realities of conflict, and I knew that these first lessons would remain with me, guiding every step, every choice, and every act of courage in the battles yet to come. The days following the battles were a blur of pain, exhaustion, and reflection. My shoulder throbbed constantly from the graze of a musket ball, a reminder that each movement carried the risk of reopening old wounds. Blisters from marching and minor cuts from barbed underbrush ached, but it was not just the physical pain that weighed heavily upon me. Nights were the hardest. Sleep came fitfully plagued by the echoing cries of fallen comrades and the relentless replay of gunfire and cannon blasts in my mind. The fog of battle had followed me home, invisible yet insistent, pressing on my chest and clouding my thoughts. I found myself waking in the night, heart racing ears, straining for imagined enemy footsteps. Simple tasks that had once been effortless, eating, walking, tying a knot, now felt laden with tension and caution. The constant awareness of mortality had carved a new dimension of fear into my consciousness, one that training alone could never erase. At times, I questioned whether I had the strength to continue, whether the ideals that had drawn me into this fight were worth the relentless cost. Yet, even amidst this mental and physical turmoil, small victories offered glimpses of resilience. Each morning, I forced myself to rise, to tend to my wounds, to rejoin my unit, and confront the day's uncertainties. I began to understand that recovery was not only a matter of healing flesh, but also of confronting the mind, of reclaiming focus and purpose, despite the shadows of trauma. Pain became both teacher and companion, reminding me of the fragility of life and the stakes of the struggle I had chosen. By embracing this reality, I found a quiet determination growing within me. The war had imprinted itself upon my body and mind, shaping who I was becoming. I understood in a way I never had before that endurance was measured not only in strength or skill, but in the capacity to confront fear, to navigate the lingering echoes of trauma, and to press forward when every instinct screamed to flee. This understanding, harsh and unyielding, was the first true turning point in my journey through the firestorm of revolution. The cost of battle was not limited to the scars etched into my body. It reached far deeper into the hearts and minds of those who survived. One by one, I witnessed the faces of friends I had trained and laughed alongside disappear beneath the mud and smoke of the battlefield. Each loss struck with a weight that no musket or cannon could replicate. The grief was raw, a gnawing ache that settled into my chest and refused to leave. I felt a peculiar kind of guilt, a bitter awareness that I had survived while so many others had not. I remembered Thomas, a boy from the docks who had shown me how to navigate the city streets as a child. His laughter had once echoed in the alleys, and now it was forever silenced. I thought of Henry, whose quick wit had lightened long, weary marches, and whose absence left a hollow space in our ranks. Each name, each memory became both a blessing and a burden, a reminder of what had been sacrificed for the cause we pursued. The sense of loss was compounded by the weight of responsibility. Those of us who remained carried not only our own survival, but the memory and honor of the fallen. Every decision, every movement was imbued with the knowledge that lives could be lost in an instant, and that our collective resilience depended on our capacity to endure both physically and emotionally. Amidst the grief, I began to understand the intangible strength that bound us together: loyalty, trust, and shared sacrifice. The camaraderie formed in the crucible of conflict was more than companionship. It was a lifeline. I realized that honoring the fallen meant fighting on protecting one another and carrying forward the ideals we had set out to defend. Pain and sorrow became intertwined, with purpose forging a resolve that would guide me through the hardships yet to come. In the shadow of loss, I understood that survival was inseparable from the bonds we forged, and that true courage required embracing both the fear and the grief that war demanded. After the carnage of the last engagement, our unit was fractured, weary, and stretched thin. I found myself at a crossroads, faced with a decision that weighed heavily on my conscience. The commanding officer approached me one morning, his expression grave but tinged with confidence. "Samuel," he said, "your courage has been noted. We need you on reconnaissance. Your skill, your awareness, and your ability to read the land could save lives. The front lines are not the only place where a soldier's actions matter." At first, the proposition felt like a betrayal of my own pride. I had trained to fight to shoulder a musket alongside my comrades, to be part of the fray. Stepping back from direct combat felt like abandoning the very ideals that had drawn me to the revolution. I wrestled with conflicting emotions: fear for my safety, guilt at leaving others to face the front lines, and the nagging sense that perhaps this was an opportunity to make a different kind of difference. I spent long hours weighing the choice, recalling the faces of the fallen and the lessons of survival. I thought about Thomas and Henry, about the men who had laughed, argued, and bled beside me. Could I honor their memory by using my skills to protect those still living, even if it meant I would no longer be in the thick of battle? Each scenario played in my mind the potential consequences of success or failure pressing down on me. In the end, I accepted the assignment, understanding that courage was not measured solely by proximity to the enemy, but by the impact of one's actions. I learned quickly that reconnaissance demanded patience, observation, and decisiveness. Every choice, whether to advance, to hide, or to report, carried weight, and I became acutely aware of the ripple effects of my decisions on both the campaign and my comrades. The transition was humbling. I realized that the battlefield was not the only classroom, and that leadership and responsibility often manifested in unexpected ways. My role had changed, but my commitment had not. I embraced the new challenges, recognizing that survival strategy and the welfare of others were as crucial to the revolution as the bravery displayed in open combat. Through this decision, I began to see the war in its full complexity, understanding that true contribution often demanded flexibility, discernment, and the willingness to step into roles that tested not only courage but character. As I moved through the towns and villages behind the front lines, the war revealed itself not only in blood and smoke, but in its profound impact on the lives of ordinary people. Homes had been abandoned, markets lay empty, and the streets, once filled with children's laughter, were now haunted by silence and uncertainty. I witnessed families forced from their homes, their belongings scattered or seized, and I saw the fear in the eyes of those who remained. The cost of our struggle was not borne solely by soldiers. It touched every corner of the community we sought to protect. Conversations with local residents were filled with equal parts hope and despair. Some whispered gratitude for the protection the revolutionary forces offered, while others feared retaliation from the crown's soldiers. Each interaction underscored the complexity of our fight. Freedom could inspire courage, but it could also bring suffering to those it aimed to liberate. I began to understand that the ideals of liberty were inseparable from responsibility, and that the consequences of our actions extended far beyond the battlefield. The news from the larger campaigns reached us in fragments: reports of victories, retreats, and strategic maneuvers. I watched as these shifts in fortune influenced morale, resource distribution, and the safety of civilians. A town spared in one engagement could be devastated in the next, and the delicate balance between military objectives and civilian well-being became painfully apparent. My role, though removed from direct combat at times, required awareness of these dynamics and an understanding of how intelligence and decisions in reconnaissance could tip the scales, preserving lives or inadvertently endangering them. These observations forced me to confront the realities of leadership and moral responsibility. War was no longer an abstract struggle of ideals versus tyranny. It was a living, breathing force reshaping communities, families, and individuals. I realized that each choice, whether to engage, report, or avoid, carried weight not just for myself, but for countless others. The complexity of the social and political fabric we were entangled in humbled me and instilled a new sense of purpose. I understood that survival and action were intertwined with empathy, strategy, and foresight, and that the true measure of a soldier lay as much in the care for those around him as in his skill on the battlefield. The months spent navigating battlefields, witnessing loss, and bearing the burdens of responsibility had altered me in ways I could hardly articulate. I was no longer the eager, untested boy who had left Boston. I had become a man shaped by hardship, resilience, and the unyielding demands of war. The idealism that had once driven me now coexisted with a keen awareness of reality, the fragility of life, the complexity of human nature, and the heavy cost of liberty. I learned to control fear rather than be controlled by it. Where once I had hesitated, I now acted decisively, balancing instinct with reason. I observed the subtle rhythms of battle, anticipating both danger and opportunity. I discovered that courage was not constant. It fluctuated, requiring effort, reflection, and self-discipline to sustain. Each decision I made, whether in reconnaissance aid to comrades or tactical judgment, demanded consideration of both immediate and long-term consequences. Equally, I came to understand the value of empathy and camaraderie. The bonds forged through shared suffering and triumph were profound, anchoring me when despair threatened to overwhelm. I learned to honor the fallen not only through memory, but through action, protecting the living, supporting my fellow soldiers, and contributing to the collective effort with diligence and care. The weight of responsibility no longer paralyzed me, it guided me. My perspective on the revolution itself deepened. Liberty was not merely a concept to be defended with musket and cannon. It was a living principle, fragile and demanding constant vigilance. I grasped that freedom required sacrifice not only of comfort or safety, but often of personal desire and ego. The suffering I had witnessed of comrades, civilians, and even myself underscored the cost. Yet it also illuminated the purpose of our struggle to create a future where justice and self-determination could flourish even amid the shadows of hardship. By the time the unit prepared for the next phase of the campaign, I felt a quiet confidence tempered by humility. I had grown in skill, resilience, and understanding. The war had been an unrelenting teacher. Though challenges lay ahead, I was no longer simply reacting to events. I was learning to navigate them, to act with foresight, and to shoulder the weight of consequence. In this transformation, I discovered not only the demands of survival, but the deeper meaning of service loyalty and the enduring pursuit of a cause greater than oneself. The final gunfire had faded, leaving behind a silence that felt both foreign and profound. The war I had entered as a boy with uncertain resolve had finally come to an end, and I found myself standing amidst the remnants of battlefields that had shaped me, scarred both in body and in spirit. Boston, once bustling with familiar streets and lively markets, bore the marks of conflict buildings, charred roads, scarred, and the air heavy with the lingering scent of gunpowder. But life was slowly returning, tentative and cautious. I walked through the streets, taking in the faces of those who had endured alongside me. Comrades weary, but alive, families beginning to reclaim their homes and neighbors offering small smiles, despite the memories of loss. My heart was heavy with the recollection of friends who had fallen, men whose laughter and courage had accompanied me through the darkest hours, now gone forever. Yet, amidst the grief, a quiet relief settled over me. The fighting was over, and the possibility of rebuilding, of nurturing the freedom we had fought for, was finally within reach. As I paused near the harbor, gazing at the ships that had once symbolized both opportunity and oppression, I realized that this was not simply the end of a battle, but the beginning of a new chapter. The war had claimed much, but it had also taught me the value of courage, the weight of responsibility, and the importance of holding on to hope, even in the shadow of devastation. I breathed deeply, feeling both the exhaustion and the quiet pride that comes from having survived a storm that had tested every fiber of my being. The war left more than scars on my skin. It etched itself deep into my mind. My shoulder ached constantly from the musket graze I had sustained months ago, and my legs were stiff from endless marches. Simple movements reminded me of the battles I had endured, a physical echo of the trials that had shaped me. Yet the wounds of the body were only part of the burden. Nights were restless, haunted by visions of fallen comrades, the cries of civilians caught in crossfire, and the relentless chaos of smoke and gunfire. I often awoke in cold sweats, heart racing, replaying moments I wished I could forget. Survivor's guilt gnawed at me, an ever-present reminder that I had lived while so many others had not. I found myself hesitant, cautious, and at times overwhelmed by the weight of memory. Even the smallest sound, a distant bark, a creaking floorboard, could send me back to those perilous hours on the battlefield. Yet amidst this mental and physical toll, I began to understand the value of endurance and reflection. I learned that healing was not only tending to flesh, but also to the mind, and that the acceptance of what had occurred was part of the path forward. These hardships instilled in me a profound appreciation for the fragility of life and the strength it takes to continue living with purpose. Though the war had marked me indelibly, it had also given me a deeper awareness of courage, resilience, and the preciousness of peace. Returning to Boston after months of war was both a relief and a shock. The streets I had once known so intimately were altered. Some buildings stood in ruins, others bore the scars of cannon fire, and the hum of daily life was cautious and measured. Families rebuilt their homes, merchants reopened their shops, and children cautiously ventured into the streets, again their laughter tentative yet hopeful. Amidst this fragile renewal, I felt both the joy of reunion and the weight of absence. Seeing my family again was overwhelming. My mother's eyes glistened with tears as she embraced me, her hands trembling against my shoulders. My father's stern expression softened, betraying relief and pride, and my siblings clung to me, eager to hear stories of my survival. Yet in their joy, I could not ignore the memories of friends lost or the suffering of neighbors who had not been so fortunate. Their faces reminded me that freedom was hard won and that the war's impact lingered far beyond the battlefield. Reintegrating into civilian life demanded patience and reflection. I learned to navigate the shifting dynamics of a community reshaped by conflict, where trust and camaraderie had been tested and rebuilt. Conversations with fellow survivors were tinged with both relief and mourning as we shared experiences and honored those who had fallen. Slowly, I discovered that returning home did not mean leaving the war behind. It meant carrying its lessons, honoring its sacrifices, and finding a way to live with the memories while contributing to the fragile peace we had fought to create. In the quiet moments after the fighting had ended, I found myself reflecting on the true cost of the war. The victories we had achieved were hard won, yet they came with a weight that no medal or celebration could lighten. I thought of friends who had fallen, of families displaced, and of the countless civilians who had borne the brunt of our struggle. Each memory reminded me that freedom is neither free nor easily attained. I realized that the sacrifices we had made were not in vain, but they demanded recognition and respect. Courage and heroism were not measured solely in moments of glory on the battlefield, but in the willingness to endure hardship, to support one another, and to make choices that preserve the lives and dignity of those around us. The lessons of empathy, responsibility, and resilience became as vital as any skill with a weapon. These reflections deepened my understanding of peace and liberty. I saw that the freedom we had fought for required continual care and vigilance, not just in laws and governance, but in the daily lives of the people it was meant to serve. The memories of war, of loss, and endurance became guides, reminders of what had been endured and what must be preserved. Through this understanding, I carried forward not only the scars of battle, but the enduring values of sacrifice, compassion, and the unyielding pursuit of a life lived with conscience and purpose. As I stood on the hill overlooking the city, the echoes of battle faded into memory, leaving only the wind and the distant murmur of life returning. The war had changed everything. My body bore its marks, my mind carried its weight, and yet I had survived, transformed by every trial and every loss. I understood now that freedom demanded courage, sacrifice, and resilience, and that the bonds forged in conflict were among the most enduring lessons of life. The memories of those who had fallen would remain with me, guiding my choices and reminding me of the price of liberty. In their honor, I would live with purpose, nurture peace, and carry forward the ideals that had sustained us. Though the smoke had cleared and the guns were silent, the storm of war left a lasting imprint on my soul, a reminder that courage, hope, and remembrance are the legacies we carry beyond the battlefield.